Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and today our topic is questions about criminal justice. Our attorney is Jeff Fogel. He's an esteemed civil rights attorney. But before we get into our program, we'd just like to ask the counselor to give us a little background about yourself.
Sure, Mel. Well, you could probably tell by my age, I've been around a little while. I've been practicing law for 47 years, most of that time doing civil rights litigation. I started out my career doing an extensive amount of criminal defense work as well. I have been senior counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union of New York. I was the executive director of the New Jersey Civil Liberties Union. I was the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I have taught civil rights and civil liberties at Rutgers Law School and NYU Law School.
Okay, well then, you're the person we need to have on this program about this subject, which is the conventional wisdom is that stop and frisk reduce crimes and keep people safer. Could you elaborate on that one?
Well, I think the clearest example is what happened in New York. New York had the most aggressive program of stop and frisk of anywhere in the nation. And of course, the police commissioner claimed that it was keeping crime down and that it was necessary in order to get guns off the street. Well, a federal judge found that that program was unconstitutional. And the new mayor who came in, Mayor de Blasio, stopped the program with a new police commissioner. And guess what? There's been a reduction in crime in New York City. So the real evidence is it doesn't do anything to reduce crime. And one could well argue that it increases crime, because to the extent that this has an impact, which it clearly does, on police-community relations, it prevents the police from getting the cooperation of the community that they need in order to solve serious crimes. So in my view, it's a detriment to crime solving by the police.
Okay, well, here in Charlottesville, the chief of police put out a report which you had comments on. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, in a general sense, yes, certainly. I've been tracking stop and frisk in Charlottesville for the last 4 years. And I can say with confidence that nothing has changed. When I say nothing has changed, approximately 120 people a year are stopped by the police. Approximately 75 to 80% of them each year are African American. Approximately 80 to 85% of the people who are stopped have done absolutely nothing. And if you look, for example, at the statistics that I just received from the police department, we had only one instance where a gun was taken during a stop. And so most of the people being stopped are being stopped for very minor offenses. And in fact, when you look at the statistics broken down by race, you see that the police are more likely to find criminal activity by white people than they are by black people. So it is particularly strange that 80% of the people stopped this year so far were African American and only 20% white. Well, that's what the statistics are showing, and it's pretty hard for anybody to argue what the facts are. These are statistics being gathered by the police department. I'm not making them up. And I have some questions about whether they're actually the full statistics, but even if we just deal with what the police chief said. And of course, he did say he was concerned about the number of people being stopped and frisked who have done absolutely nothing. And we have to remember how impactful this process is. You know, in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson put together a task force on policing. And one of the things they talked about was how bad stop and frisk practices were in terms of developing police-community relations, particularly in African American communities. They talked about it in the sense that people view the police as an occupying force. And the primary way that the police exercise that is with stop and frisk. It's not the few murders that occur. It is stop and frisk, which is the constant presence of the police asserting their authority in the community, but in only one particular community. So there's a long history, not only to stop and frisk, there's a long history of the government saying it doesn't work and it's only exacerbating problems.
Okay, well, when can you legally, I mean, this is where our audience is saying, well, when can you legally frisk or search or have your car searched by the police?
Well, according to the law, a police officer must have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that you're engaged in criminal activity in order to stop you in a car or on the street. Now that means that the police officer actually has to point to facts that lead to a reasonable conclusion that you may be engaged in crime. Not that you're guilty. We don't get to that until there's a trial. Not even that you're probably guilty, but that there's a reasonable suspicion. It can't be a hunch. It can't be a vague suspicion. There have to be facts in order to do that. But let me caution people, because you don't know what facts the police may be relying on if and when they stop you. Police officer may have information that somebody fitting your description just robbed a bank around the corner. Well, you had nothing to do with it and you know nothing about it. But the police officer can still stop you if you met that description. Now, hopefully, the first thing you'll do is ask a police officer, may I leave? And if not, why are you stopping me? And hopefully the police officer will tell you, which will then give you an opportunity to explain to the police officer you're not guilty of what he might suspect or she might suspect that you're guilty of. In order for a police officer to go further after stopping you, and such as conduct a pat-down, the police officer must have, again, reasonable articulable suspicion, facts, that leads to a reasonable conclusion that you're armed and dangerous. If an officer has that information, they may engage in a pat-down, just a pat-down, of the outer part of your clothing in order to determine whether or not you have a weapon. And then only if the police officer reasonably concludes that there is a weapon could they go into your pocket to take that weapon out. So that's the standard that the law imposes for when they may stop you, and when after stopping you they may subject you to a frisk, pat down of your outer clothing, or a further search.
Okay, so let's give our audience a little advice as the proper procedure when they're either stopped by the police in a vehicle or on the street.
Well, let's start with the vehicle.
Okay.
Driving a vehicle is considered a privilege under the law. And so they have greater rights to require things of you than they would on the street, because it's not yet illegal, or it's not yet a privilege, rather, to walk on the street. You are obligated under the law to provide an officer who stops you with your license and registration. And you're actually, as a matter of law, required to do nothing further. If we talk about what the smart thing to do, though, because your rights to do things may be different than what the smart thing to do is. We've seen too many instances where police officers have shot people and then claimed, he was taking out his wallet and I thought it was a gun. He was, moving his hands around and I thought he was trying to hide something, and therefore I dragged him out of the car and he fought with me and I shot him. You don't want to be in that position. As I tell people, if you're confronted with a robber on the street with a gun, you don't get into an argument or fight the robber. You give up the money and worry about it later. Your life isn't worth it. Police officers not only have guns, they have batons, they have stun guns, they have tasers, and they have the power of arrest, and they're more likely to believe than you are for a whole variety of reasons. So the smart thing to do is to cooperate in the fashion that's necessary. Now, you have the right not to say anything at all to a police officer, but it may be the smart thing to do is to cooperate at least to the extent that you provide them, say, with identifying information about who you are, which may be even your license when you're on the street. No obligation to identify yourself under the law, but it may be the smart thing to do so. And let's remember that this is not a problem principally for the white community. White people generally who are stopped are not considered to be criminals. The problem has been the way the police have treated minority communities, black and brown people. And so both with respect to being stopped on the street and perhaps even more importantly being stopped in a car. Because a police officer may be nervous when they stop African Americans in the car because they may have the belief that African Americans are dangerous to them. Well, that's wrong, that belief. But you want to live. You want to do the smart thing, and that is what they want you to do, which may be, in many instances, turning on the light and putting your hands on the wheel. The importance of that is so that they can see your hands at all time and cannot later claim that you were making some kind of furtive gesture or even pulling out your wallet. Wait till the officer tells you that he wants you to take out your license and registration. And I would tell them, officer, I am reaching into my pocket to get my wallet in order to provide you with my license and registration. It makes all kinds of sense to be respectful. We have to move to a society that doesn't differentiate on the basis of race. in which officers do not consider everybody they stop to be a danger to them, and that they see them as part of the same community in which they live. But until we reach that point, you've got to be cool and you've got to be smart. And being smart is recognizing the relative powers between yourself and a police officer on the scene and doing what makes a smart thing to do, which is to provide them with the information they need. Now, that's not to say that you should fully cooperate with them. Any criminal defense lawyer will tell you not to go there. We've seen too many instances where somebody is stopped, there are people in their car, and the police officers want to run a record check on the passengers in the car. Now, if you have a record, I wouldn't suggest that you, quote, cooperate with the police by doing so. Always be respectful and decline to provide that information. Because then what we've seen is the police go back and find it, they see that you've got a prior record, all of a sudden they're even more suspicious of you, and they might then take you out of the car and pat you down even if it's not illegal. It is not wise to provide any of that kind of information, certainly by a passenger. And so that would be my recommendation about the point at which you stop, quote, cooperating, but always, always be respectful on the scene. It will get you nowhere, and it might get you arrested, and it might get you hurt if you do otherwise. Again, we have to move to a different society. We have to move to a different method and manner of policing. But until we get there, be cool and be smart.
So what I'm hearing is that there's two separate standards for a passenger or procedures for a passenger and a driver.
Precisely.
The passenger, you're saying, what do you mean by don't be cooperative?
Well, don't be cooperative. I'm saying that you should be cooperative up to a point, but there is no reason to freely talk to the police.
Okay.
You can be, if you not tell them the truth, you can be charged with a crime and go to jail just for not telling them the truth. So you have nothing to gain by engaging in a long conversation with a police officer. And in fact, you can respectfully say, I decline to answer any questions, officer. But again, the key to this is acting respectful. Say, I do not want to answer. I will respectfully decline to answer any questions.
Okay.
But be respectful.
Okay. Well, let me now ask you, what is it, what are your rights then? We talked about rights. We were just talking about stopping police and what is the wise thing to do when you're confronted by the police. We talked about that. But what are your remedies if you believe the police have acted illegally?
Well, you have several remedies. The first remedy that the police want you to do is to file a complaint with the police department. And I'll talk about that in a second. The second remedy you have is to file a lawsuit. When the Congress of the United States, during that brief period of real reconstruction after the Civil War, passed the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That amendment was designed to protect the newly freed slaves from officials in the state. Before that, people had no protection under the federal Constitution from officials in their state. The Constitution only protected them from federal officials. And there were not that many of them back then. There was no FBI back in 1865 when the Civil War was on. And so they passed not only the 14th Amendment, but they passed a law saying any person whose rights have been violated by an official of the state has a right to come to federal court and to sue that official. And then later in the next century, they actually provided attorney's fees for an attorney who successfully went ahead with an action like that on behalf of somebody whose rights were violated. Unfortunately, there are very few of us willing to take those cases. There are a lot of problems with that kind of litigation, and if you don't get anything if you don't win, and you can put in a lot of time.
Right.
But that is a remedy, and certainly one that I regularly use whenever I file suit. And for some of our more conservative friends who are watching, remember, you could not have sued over your rights under the Second Amendment, your right to own and carry a gun, if this law wasn't in place. The very people who brought the lawsuit to establish your individual right to possess and carry a weapon used that same law. That law is 42 United States Code Section 1983, passed in the early 1870s. So this is a law that actually protects everybody, allows everybody to protect their constitutional rights. And I constantly tell the people who are, the gun advocates, you ought to celebrate the civil rights law because that's the only way you could have established your right to have a gun. Now let's go back to filing a complaint with the police department. And let's be very specific about Charlottesville and Albemarle. In Charlottesville, after a long struggle, the police department agreed that they would provide the complainant, the person who's complaining about police conduct, with the results of their investigation. And that was only about 3 years ago. Before that, you had no right to know anything about what happened to your complaint. And unfortunately, that's the situation in Albemarle with the police department. You file a complaint, you never find out what happens. There's nothing on their website, in their annual reports, that says anything about how many citizen complaints were sustained. In Charlottesville, the same thing. Now, I, of course, have had the opportunity, because people have come to me after they file complaints, to look at the quality of the investigation being conducted by the police department. And it's lacking, particularly since the police department tends to always believe the police officer and never believe the citizen. The reasons why we've been able to have these conversations in the last year or two is because of citizens taking videos and where we've seen an African American being shot in the back. Well, when that comes out as a video, they're in a difficult position to sustain the conduct of the police officer. But in most instances, we don't have that. And we'd expect a fair investigation, but we don't get it. Interestingly enough, a couple of families came to me with a letter from the Internal Affairs declining their complaint, but telling them you can come in and talk to us if you have any further questions. So I was going to go in with the families, but then they were told by the police department, you can't bring a lawyer in, or at least you can't bring Mr. Fogel into this process. And so they're not really willing to even allow somebody to be an advocate for people who are making these complaints. Okay, I'm sorry.
Let's take a little break here, halfway through. This is the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. The topic is questions about criminal justice. And we have as our guest attorney Jeff Fogel, civil rights attorney. So let's get back to where we were. Could you continue? I mean, I kind of stopped you in midair, but right. You were talking about the
internal affairs process.
Okay.
As I said, it's worse in Albemarle since you'll never find out. What's interesting to me is that in a recent brochure put out by the Albemarle County Police Department, where they argue not to ever argue with a police officer on the scene, but file a complaint. And then, of course, they don't respond and tell you what happened with that complaint. Well, they're never going to get the trust of the community if they don't respond and are open with their complaint process. But even more importantly, from a law enforcement point of view, if a citizen knows that they can get no remedy from the police department, some people will seek justice on the scene. And that's the danger to the police department. So it's in the interest of every police officer that there be a fair and open process for determining citizen complaints. We all know, however, that in a relatively small police department such as we have both in Albemarle and Charlottesville, it's going to be difficult for the police to judge themselves. These are colleagues who they've worked with for years, and to get to call one of them a liar, which is sometimes the case, is going to be very difficult. What we need in both instances is what's called a civilian review board. It's something that New York City has now instituted in a better way, something that the city of Newark, New Jersey has embraced. That is, the mayor, the city council have embraced this notion. And so you have a body of public citizens who are appointed with the power to subpoena and with an investigator who will look into these matters, who will then come up with a fair and impartial report. And even if that report is subject to a decision by the police chief, at least the investigation and the recommendation has been made by an independent body. Now, this is important in order to have transparency and accountability, and both of them, and every police officer, every police chief will tell you that, are important to develop trust with the community. After all, as I said, it's not just a question of treating people fairly in all communities. It's a question of if the police need the cooperation of people in those communities to solve the serious crimes that exist, they need that cooperation, and they won't get it if people don't trust them. Now, one thing I've talked to, and most recently with the city manager, for example, in Charlottesville, it was admitted by the former police chief Longo, and it was admitted when he presented his case to the city council by Chief Thomas, that there have been some instances of illegality when people have been stopped and frisked. But they will not tell anybody who it was who was subject to that illegality. They believe that there's only a few, a handful, let's say. There may be more, but we've been trying to get access to the information that would allow us to know whether it's done, and they have completely refused to provide it. I filed a lawsuit on behalf of the NAACP and the public housing residents. We lost because there's a big hole in the law that allows them to keep this secret. But what I said to Mr. Jones, the city manager, was, imagine if the police department, when they found that some of the searches, in their opinion, were illegal, reached out to the victims of those searches and said, we apologize, and we want to give you some compensation. What if they were to give them $500 if they were subject to an illegal search? We're talking about, let's say, 5 instances. We don't know, but let's say 5. It costing the city $2,500 a year to do that. Can you imagine what the reaction of the community would be if the police department was reaching out and saying, we're sorry, we violated your constitutional rights, and here's some compensation? $2,500. That's nothing in the city budget, but imagine the kind of trust and confidence that would instill in the people that the police department in the city really cares. Very simple device.
Okay, let's compare what the Civil Review Board you're talking with what they have in place now.
Well, what they have in place is one sergeant who's responsible for, I'm talking about Charlottesville, and one sergeant in Albemarle responsible for all internal affairs complaints. Now, that doesn't just involve complaints by citizens, it also involves complaints by superior officers against lower ranking officers. And again, from what I've seen,
don't they have a civil review board?
Nothing, just that sergeant. That sergeant then conducts whatever investigation he wants to conduct in order to come to the conclusion whether or not any policies or procedures of the department or any violations of law have occurred as a result of the police action, and then makes a recommendation to the chief. And the chief either accepts it, rejects it, sends it back. My limited experience with getting that information is the police always accept the recommendation of the sergeant, and the sergeant always accepts the word of a police officer over a citizen. Okay. So I am confident that there is no confidence in that process.
Well, I was under the impression there was a volunteer citizens board over in Charlottesville.
Not at all. There is something called the Citizens Advisory Panel.
Okay, that's right.
Well, that's been a rubber stamp for the police chief. They sit around and I don't know what. I went to one meeting and they weren't doing much of anything. They were just having a nice conversation with the police chief and suggesting some very minor things. Their meetings are not publicized by the city. Nobody knows when they're conducted. They've never made a report to anybody. And they simply sit there and talk to the police chief.
Well,
They've been handpicked, for the most part, by the police chief, which has been rubber stamped by the city council. And so it's this body that, from my view, over the last 4 or 5 years I've been watching this, does nothing. They haven't done anything about these statistics. They never even asked for these statistics. It's been those of us on the outside who've been pressing this issue. I've been doing it along with the NAACP, public housing residents, and a variety of other activists in the community who see a problem between police and the community.
Well, how would you advise this advisory committee?
Well, I think we have to move in, as I said before, to a civilian review board. And they've got to not be handpicked. They've got to be real people from the community that the community trusts is actually conducting fair and impartial investigations of complaints by the community, and that they know that they can get recourse if they're right. Now, not every complaint's going to be right, clearly, but then they owe it an explanation of why what happened wasn't right, why their complaint was not founded. For example, if somebody stopped on the street and they were totally innocent and they go complain, well, as I explained before, you may not have the information that a police officer has when he or she stops you. So if that's explained to the citizen, as I try to do with my clients, don't always assume that they're just harassing you. If that is explained to the citizen and they can understand why the officer stopped them, that goes a long way too. But they don't have confidence in the process. That's the problem. We need a situation where people have confidence in the process, and it's not going to come through the current internal affairs procedures.
Okay, we have to wrap up, but I'm going to make a two-part question for you. The conventional wisdom is that stop and frisk gets guns off the street, therefore prevents murders. And the second part is, could you sum up what you think are or feel that our audience should take with them?
Well, as I said in the first part, we have strong evidence that stop and frisk program doesn't really work, doesn't stop crime, and that police officers would be much more productively used in the investigation of crime. We also know that police-community relations are important, not just because the police work for us, but because the police need the confidence of the community in order to be able to solve crimes. They need the cooperation of people to solve particularly the very serious crimes, murders that have occurred in our community and elsewhere. Let me just sum up. People need to be smart and cool when they interact with the police. And that sometimes means not exercising your rights. It means being smart in being polite and respectful. That, I think, is the most important thing to do. Be polite and be respectful. You may say, may I leave? First thing I would say if I was stopped by an officer on the scene. Secondly, why are you stopping me? And then I would never get into an argument on the scene. You're not going to get anywhere. I certainly wouldn't resist arrest, although I have to say in Virginia you have a right to resist an unlawful arrest, but it would be a very stupid thing to do. And I could go on at length about why that would be stupid. We need to have our citizens be working on these issues and demanding of their elected officials a more open and transparent police departments. We need a civilian review board. We need that system in place, and we can get it in place if our local politicians make it happen. But we need the citizens to come forward and talk to their politicians on the local level, the city council, board of supervisors, and insist that this is the right way to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Counselor. This is the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. Our guest has been Attorney Jeff Fogel, civil rights attorney, and the topic has been questions about criminal justice. And I think we did a great job on that. Thank you very much. Just to remind you, you can see the Neighborhood Law Center on Mondays on Comcast or this local public station at 10 CPA TV at 10 p.m. on Mondays. But also you can go to our website, Neighborhood Law Center, neighborhoodlawcenter.com. And also we're on YouTube. Just Google Neighborhood Law Center and it'll come up. So again, the Neighborhood Law Center, thanks for watching. Our attorney, Jeff Fogel, and we'll see you next week. Peace and God bless.